My name is Kimberly Ellman. I am the manager of National Mentorship Programming at Best Friends Animal Society. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Today, we're going to meet with 4 industry leaders who are working hard to create a culture of engagement amongst their staff, with their boards of directors, and their communities. And each of our panelists will share how effectively engaging others can help elevate your life-saving work. They all offer a unique perspective based on their individual animal welfare professional experience. But before I introduce our 4 panelists and get started, I do have a few housekeeping items for you. Everyone is automatically muted for the presentation portion of this webinar, so you do not have to worry about accidentally unmuting yourself. If you do have a question at any point, please type it into the Q&A box. I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat throughout this webinar. Please note that any questions submitted through the Q&A are only visible on our end. You will not be able to see them, nor will the rest of the audience. We may pause for a few minutes throughout this presentation to answer questions from the Q&A if they are relevant to the topic we're discussing at hand. And then, time permitting, we will try and take additional questions at the end of this presentation, again, if we have the time to do so. I do want to note that this webinar is being recorded, and please keep an eye in the chat box, because at the end of the webinar, I'll post a link to some resources. And then the webinar recording will be available on our network partner website in the next few days. So let's go ahead and introduce our 4 panelists. We'll start with Jose Ocaño. Jose is the Senior Director of People and Culture at Best Friends Animal Society. And prior to joining us at Best Friends, he was the former Director of Pima Animal Care and Control in Tucson, Arizona. Next, we have Don Jennings, Senior Strategist for Learning Advancement. And Don also works with our Shelter Embed program at Best Friends Animal Society. Next is Nikki Cruikshank, the Executive Director of Midlands Humane Society in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And last, but certainly not least, we have Mark Story, the CEO of Haven Humane Society in Redding, California. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much for taking time to share your expertise and experiences with us. So we do have a lot of ground to cover over the next hour. We want to talk about defining culture, engaging staff, community engagement, and then of course, board support and relations. So I want to start with defining culture, and I'll begin with Jose, because this question is extremely timely, as Jose presented at the Best Friends National Conference last week around culture and our Culture Initiative Playbook. And I'll give you guys a little hint that playbook is included in our link with the resources. So Jose, why is it important to define your organization's culture?
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. So first, let me just talk a little bit about what culture is, so that we kind of all have the same framework. And one of my former bosses, Judah Batista, who's a co-founder of Best Friends, said it to me best once. He's like, culture is how we do things around here. It really is our how. Our organizations, a lot of times we get really focused on what we do. We're outcomes driven because it matters, because we're talking about animals' lives, people's lives that we're engaging with and hoping to make better. But how we do that is what culture is. And through the how is what experience people are getting. And so that's where you hear things like satisfaction rate, engagement rate, morale. It's all a byproduct of your how. And so that's just really important. And every organization does things, which means you have a culture. Likely you have multiple cultures, and whether I'm working here at Best Friends, or whether it was the decade I spent at Pima Animal Care Center, or the few years I spent at the Central Florida SPCA, we had multiple cultures. The shelter had a culture, the ACOs had a culture, the clinic had a culture, the adoptions team had a culture, the volunteer team had a culture. And sometimes when your culture is not intentional, when you're not clear about what you want your culture to be, you'll have culture clashes. And it's, the right hand and the left hand aren't necessarily operating from the same philosophical approach. And I'll give, like in Pima, our shelter team the culture there was life-saving. How do we stop animals from coming in? How do we have their length of stay here as short as possible? And how do we get them out, ideally in a live outcome? Enforcement culture was, we need to write tickets. We need to bring these animals in. We just walked into a hoarding case. I don't really care what the situation is. We're bringing in 80 cats right now. It was the clash. And I realized early on that we were just operating with 2 very different cultures, 2 different ideas of what success looks like. And so it becomes imperative to understand and define what your culture is, because if you don't, then your culture works against your interests and what your mission and what your goals are. And so one of the things we did at Best Friends at the beginning of I think it was actually the beginning of 2020, was we did all of these workshops. We always had values at Best Friends. We called them guiding principles. And, there are things like leadership and transparency and kindness and positive influence. And then there's about, a 1 to 2 sentence definition of what those are. And what we wanted to really understand was, how do these show up every day for people in the workplace? So we did a lot of workshop with staff, volunteers, our founders, to really distill down, like, what does kindness mean? How should kindness show up? And so not only did we get really clear on like what are our values, but we've gotten clear or clearer on how they show up every single day. And you want to make sure that your culture, which are usually there's going to be values that are kind of your foundation of that those are the things that work for you, that you're really intentional. If you've had them for a decade, are those still the ones that serve you? And do they serve you in the way that you're hoping to operate, into the future? And so it becomes a really critical step of defining your culture, being intentional about what those values are, making sure they're measurable, trainable, and that that everybody has a really clear understanding of what is expected of us when we show up every single day. And it doesn't mean we're perfect all the time, but it does mean we have a set of like our social contract with each other that we're all super clear on. And I think about, we have a document called our Guiding Principles in Action, which is the byproduct of all those workshops that we did. And it's when I'm stuck, it's when I'm pissed and frustrated and just like not in a great place, where I find going back to like, what is our culture? What are our values? And they always guide me through it in a way that's constructive and productive. So it's so important that you understand what culture is, and that you're incredibly intentional and deliberate about what that means and how it's supposed to show up every day.
Thank you, Jose. So Don, I want to ask you, you do a lot of consulting with shelter leadership around various operational infrastructure and development and board relations and marketing and communications. How should you communicate your culture once you've defined it to your internal and external stakeholders?
All right, thank you, Kimberly, and hello, anonymous crowd of attendees. Jose did a fantastic job of talking about how if you're not intentional about your culture, then your other cultures will spring up on their own. It's happening whether you're doing anything or not. Your job is to be intentional about it. And he also touched on good ways to communicate this, to make sure that everyone in your organization is on board with what's up. You end up with documents. You have workshops around what people perceive your how to be. You train for it. And then for me, what I found, over the last 6 or 7 years, I mostly did sort of organizations that were in full-blown crisis. I would sort of parachute in on my own and try to fix everything all at once in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. And part of it was the culture. The culture that they had in common in all of these places was we'll call it absolute chaos. All right, if that's a culture, they found themselves at loose ends with no leadership, with no direction. And my response to that as a leader every time, and what I would encourage people to embrace themselves, is something that a boss told me about years back when I was younger. He was one of the most amazing leaders I've ever had in my life. He transformed my life personally. But he used to describe what he did, which I saw to be almost magical, right? Which was lead a large group of young people in one powerful direction. He used to just describe it as leadership by walking around. That's what he said it was. I lead by walking around. And so expanding on that a little bit, what I see to be the most effective way, first off, internally, is to have conversations with the people around you, and not conversations where you go up and say, how do you feel about the culture? No, every conversation. These are conversations within which you're able to gather information about how people are feeling, what is a challenge for them, what they're invested in, what they could care less about. And all of these things, and even the nonverbal communication, add up to a picture. And then you're able to respond to that picture. So besides the workshops and the playbooks, I also have a really thorough understanding of how they feel about what's going on, my staff every day. And externally, I think the way you do that is by first making sure that your culture is a story, right? This is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a story that everyone knows, that is everyone on your team, and then communicate it consistently and thoroughly and repeatedly via every channel you can think of. So this is social media. This is the people doing the media shots. This is who your ED is having lunch with. And that's the way that you're able to communicate culture internally and externally. It's all by action. It's by taking action and making sure that you engage and that you tell your story.
Thank you, Don. So Mark, I'm going to go to you next because you do something that Don's mentor did. He walked around, and you and I were just having a conversation recently about how you'll tell your administrative assistants, I'm just going to go walk around, and you'll go walk around and see what's going on within the shelter walls. So what is the best way within your experience to get your staff on board in addition to that walking around?
Yeah, so the walking around is huge, like Don said, and I do that. I try and do it daily, sometimes multiple times. But I think for us, one thing that we focus on is team, because it all starts with team. And so there's a couple phrases that we use often: "We not me, us not you," and those are phrases that we use as part of our core, because it's not about who does it; it's about us doing it together. And so a lot of the things that we do is we have team meetings once a quarter where we shut down, we have the whole team together, and we focus on team building exercises. We talk about we, not me. We talk about all of this stuff that we're talking about now, and we really encourage people to live it, to live the culture. And like was said by the other two speakers, everywhere we go, whether I'm having lunch with somebody, whether with the media, whether with a customer, whether with a client that is not nice, we still continue to use that culture, and we still continue to use all the things that we talk about, regardless of the situation. And sometimes it can be difficult to do that, especially when you're dealing with a difficult customer or client. But that's when it's really, really important that you stick to those and you get through it, and you help each other get through it as well.
Thank you. So that's a perfect transition. Jose, did you want to add something before we move on?
Yeah, I just I love your answer, Mark, and I also just love Mark. So I think that good guy. And so one of the things that I think about that is fundamental in getting staff on board is that culture starts at the top, and you have to actually walk that as a leader. You can't say like these are our values and then do things that are the opposite of that. And so I always, a lot of times I've been working with different executive folks who are reaching out to me because they want to, start a culture, an intentional culture initiative within their organization. And I hear all the things that everyone else has to do. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do? How are you showing up? Because the culture you have is the culture you actively are creating, whether it's intentional or not. And so for the leaders who are here on the call, I'm not a big person of hierarchy. Like, I believe we're all leaders and we all can make these maximum impactful contributions. But the reality is, within an organization, there is hierarchical. You have a CEO and senior directors and so on. And the more senior you are in your official capacity, the more responsibility you have to actually live those values. And that is one of the most effective ways that you're going to get buy-in, is by, like what Mark was saying, you have to show up in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Excellent answers. And that fits nicely into our next topic, which is engaging staff. And a lot of times in the work that Don and I do, and I know when Jose is asked to consult with some shelters, we see shelters doing a great job with life-saving work, right? They're at that 90% save rate, or they're hovering right at it. They've offered a lot of great community programs and services, but staff are feeling disconnected. They're burnt out sometimes. They have a lot of compassion fatigue. They're starting to disengage, and ultimately they're going to leave that organization or just check out mentally altogether. So it's really important, once you define your culture, as our speakers have said, to talk about ways to continually engage staff, right? So Nikki, I'd like for you to share some examples of how you engage with all staff, not just your middle managers and your supervisors and your executive leaders, but how you engage with all staff within your organization at Midlands Humane.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So following all the speakers, I mean, they all have touched on such great things and walking the walk and being part of everything and touching all staff. We do shut down once a month, and we do have all staff meetings to get together, and we do a lot of celebrations of just talking about what we've done. I have found that that has been a major impact for everybody, that when they are having a bad day and you talk about what we've done well in last month, that they're like, okay, my job's not as hard, or things aren't as tough as they really seem, because you are pointing out the things that they're doing every day that are very positive. And we talk about just what's going on in their lives and what's being impactful for them on a regular basis. And it's really helped bring the morale up overall, because we talk to them. We're not just talking at them, and we're making everybody part of the big picture. And it's just not one person or two people or a couple people on a team. It's really everybody.
Thank you. So what about for new employees? And I'll start with Mark, and then Nikki, you can jump in, and then Don and Jose, feel free to add. What do you do for new employees to engage them? And then how does that compare with existing employees?
Sure. Sorry, I'm having a little coffee attack. So we actually do an onboarding that we just started a couple of years ago, where we actually do a 3-day process for onboarding. I actually had 2 new hires today that started. They come in and they actually sit down with me first. Then they sit down with the CFO. Then they go to development. They talk to them. Then they go to our receiving department, and then the captain of animal control, and then they ride along with animal control, and that's the first day. They do some initial paperwork as well. Second day, they actually are in the kennels, and they do some stuff with the kennels. They help clean. They follow our transporter who does all the sick animals, and they go from department to department for 3 days. And they do that, and then they come in and they take all our tests and do all the SOP review and all the fun stuff there at the last day. But they don't even go to their regular job until the end of the 3rd day and check in with them basically at the end of the day and get their schedule. And what that really does is it shows them what all we do, because I think that was a piece that we were really missing as an organization in the past was, what's their buy-in? They could be working in this department and that's all they see is this department. And they don't really know where they fit in which cog they are in the wheel, right? And so now that they do that, they have that buy-in, they know where they fit. And I hammer home every time that there is nobody in our organization more important than anybody else, especially myself. Nobody. And everybody has to do their job properly for everybody else to do it. And today was a perfect example. Like I said, I had 2 new hires. I had one that was a receptionist at the hospital, and I had one that was an adoption counselor. And for the adoption counselor, I said, look, you get to see now the beginning of the process with animal control all the way through, but you'll be working at the end. And if you don't know what happens through that process, you just can't be as good an employee and you can't be as invested. So that has been really huge for us. And we've seen an uptick in staff, not only understanding better, happier with their job and staying longer, which is great.
Thanks. Nikki, are you doing anything in addition to your all staff meetings to engage existing employees?
So the existing employees, I mean, I feel like we do kind of fun little things where we put things on the whiteboard that are kind of funny questions. I mean, it could be like, what's your first car? And the staff literally fills it out every day. And if you don't have a new question up at this point, they're like, where is it? And you're like, okay, I haven't looked up my question for the day. But I mean, I feel like just little things to get to know each other too. I mean, we definitely hammer home our mission in general, but we kind of we're a small facility. We only have 17 employees. So we really work kind of like a family. And so it just helps to get to know each other in that way.
Don and Jose, do you guys have any other ideas for free or low cost staff engagement? It's not about, again, as we've discussed, throwing expensive parties once or twice a year for the staff and handing out plaques. It's really about the day-to-day ongoing engagement that keeps them committed to the mission and to the organization.
I think it's important to remember too that this kind of engagement is something, like you said, there could be really, really big things and really, really little things that you do. And an enlightened mixture of those things is how you engage across the board. I was having a conversation with a student today who's in Southern California running a shelter. and the heat is unbearable, and their facility is really old, and there's no way to cool down the dog kennels because they're all open to the outside. And then he was also just talking about the staff. And what it reminded me of was a thing that I found over these last half dozen organizations, that many of them were in super hot desert places. And I brought something with me just on a whim from when I worked at summer camp. And what I did one day was I just went out and I bought like 600 freeze pops. And freeze pops are universal. I'm here to tell you, millennial, Gen Z, everyone knows what a freeze pop is. They're completely worthless. It's just a tube of sugar water. But if you walk around with a cooler full of freeze pops on a day when it's 110, that's a small, inexpensive thing you can do. It's engaging, it's meaningful that you're carting that around. And the kind of things that you can do to connect with your staff range everything from freeze pops to fun questions on the board to galas and everything in between.
Thank you. Mark, I think you wanted to pop in and offer a suggestion, so go right ahead.
Yes. So my staff came up with this in the back. So kind of behind the scenes, we had an extra wall, and they put up, and I had to write it down, so I got it right. A top dogs and fat PHAT cats board. And it's for staff to recognize other staff and volunteers. So they just will write down a name and way to go, thanks for that. And they'll just stick it on this board, and everybody walks by it. And it has been a huge morale booster, and they really enjoy doing that stuff. And super simple, super simple. And it really has raised morale.
Thank you. And I'm going to call in Jose for a second, because I remember when he was the director at Pima Animal Care Center, I heard about these staff meetings where anybody could come in and sit around. I called them the Kumbaya meetings, but Jose, you could probably better explain those meetings than I could. So,
well, I think it's probably really similar to what Nikki was talking about. We would close one day a month on a Sunday, and we'd have all hands on deck to clean the shelter because the animals had to be cleaned. And it was cool because all of us came in, everyone whose job typically wasn't to clean kennels, we all came in to get the morning job done. And that in and of itself was just a really great team building activity. And it was something that had to happen. So it just kind of was a great opportunity. And yeah, and we would always think of this Sunday as, what's the training component? Because we know people want to grow their skill set. They want to grow their expertise. And then unless you have some dedicated time for it, it's really hard working in shelter operations to step away from whatever you're intercepting to go and do any kind of like learning. And so we created space for that. And then there was always like a fun activity, like a team building. So because at the core of it, it's about having relationships with each other. And I understood early on that if we can cultivate meaningful relationships with each other, we're going to give each other a lot more bandwidth for when we are not operating at our highest self. When we do send the kind of snippy email or it's short, it's when you have rapport with people, you're actually able to absorb and bounce back better from that. When you don't have rapport, it becomes a much different situation. So we would do crazy things like, who can build the biggest balloon tower? Everyone's right hand is tied behind their back and no one's allowed to use words. And so it was like, I have videos of this still. It was so silly. But at the end of it, you'd have people who like never worked together becoming friends afterwards, and they would always reference those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it's holding space and setting up time to actually do this work is really important. And what I want to offer everybody is think of onboarding as a year-long process. The touch points you need to have with new staff in the beginning, yes, like you need to do a lot of touch points in that first week. And I think of it as like the first week, and then it's the first like month, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then the year. And the goal is to just have meaningful conversations and check-ins with folks. And it doesn't have to just be it actually shouldn't just be the supervisor, because a lot of times they have so much going on that if you put onboarding on just one person, it's likely not going to succeed. And so how do you have the collective group help with onboarding? And so at Best Friends, we have new employee orientation. We have a program called our engagement managers, where because we are a larger organization, we have people in HR who have portfolios of staff, and it's their job to get to know these people, help them navigate the organization, be an advocate for them, help them with their growth. And so I've always found that you can scale your onboarding based on what your resources are, how big your organization is, but onboarding is important. You know, people decide within those first few months whether they're going to stay there long term or not. And it's a very expensive thing to pay for turnover. And then the last thing I'll say is part of what we had to do in PIMA, and it's still something we work on in other places, is this kind of like sink or swim. Like you start and then you're just thrown and it's like, figure it out. That is not the best way to onboard people. And I'm always told, well, that's just how it is. And I'm like, a lot of things were a certain way once upon a time in animal welfare. And we had to just have the vulnerability and commitment to do something different. And I think how we engage with our staff, there's so much room to improve that area.
Excellent. Well said. Thank you. Okay, so obviously staff engagement is critical, but as critical is community engagement, right? We have to get the community to rally behind us in order to save all the pets in our own backyard. So I want to talk with Mark and Nikki. Nikki, I'm going to start with you. Both of your organizations went through an extensive process over a period of a couple of years, and it started pre-COVID, where you took a deep dive look at your volunteer programs, you assessed your needs and your gaps, and you revitalized that program to engage more skills-based volunteers above and beyond just dog walking and cat handling. So Nikki, can you talk with us for a couple of minutes about some of the new volunteer positions that you've integrated at Midlands Humane?
Yeah, so it has been transformational for us, from going from just like it's general cleaning of animals and dog walking to now we have people helping with data entry. They definitely help with our events. They go out off-site volunteers and help with adoptions. And it's just made a huge impact overall because there's only so many staff people we can hire. And I think that was the big takeaway when we started going through this journey, that the staff were really going to get the help that they needed, even if we couldn't pay for it. And so by being able to offer some of those higher skills-based ones, and really a lot of your volunteer base already has it, we just weren't asking for it. And so if people know that what you need and what the position might be, there's people that raise their hand. They want to be part of it. They want to do more. And the more that you are transparent about it, definitely you get the help that you need. And you just have to then figure out how you want to train them, what the expectation is for them. And once you get it all put together, it definitely makes a huge impact on the volunteers and the staff at the organization.
Thank you. Mark, what about the skills-based volunteer positions that you guys created as a result of analyzing your volunteer program and positions?
Yeah, we created a lot of different opportunities for them in development, in licensing, and just a bunch of different areas. But I think one of the things that we really learned, which isn't necessarily skills-based, but it was super important, was we found deficiencies in our training of our staff when we looked at our volunteer program. And I think it's a really important message to send out there is, we found out that, hey, look, why are our staff trained differently than our volunteers when we're asking them to do the exact same thing? And so we really took a look at our training programs in general and revamped it entirely because of that. And it's really opened the doors for both volunteers and staff. And because of that, the cohesiveness between the staffs and the volunteers has gotten a ton stronger. And that line between staff and volunteer is really, really grayed out now. And it's helped immensely. And yes, the skill-based volunteers, and Nikki said it perfectly, a lot of them are out there and all you have to do is ask. And they're like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I'd totally be happy to do that. And it's like, I haven't asked before.
As we like to say, a volunteer can do anything another person can do, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about replacing staff. It's about freeing up their time to do the things you hired them that they're uniquely qualified to do. I'm sorry, Nikki, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to follow Mark and say, yeah, I think one of our biggest, things that we didn't do is put the expectation that what we wanted out there. We would say we need this or that, but we wouldn't tell them exactly what it was and how important what it was for the volunteer to show up and be there, because they were part of the team. So if they didn't show up as a volunteer, it made an effect on everybody. And so being super transparent with that stuff made a huge difference for us.
Excellent.
And you'll find that just like if you're not intentional about creating culture spring up on their own. If you're not intentional about managing the relationship between volunteers and staff, things will pop up on their own. And in my experience, it's all too easy for that to default to an oppositional relationship where in some way the staff and volunteers think that they're different. So what Mark was talking about aligning volunteer training with staff training, it's not just smart for building camaraderie across both of those groups of people, but even legally, it's way smarter to make sure that you are training your volunteers in the exact same way that you train your employees, because you are asking them to do the same thing. So outside of salary and benefits, they should get the exact same training that your staff get, because you could find yourself liable for a volunteer's actions in the same way as an employee. And there's even, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard from friends who say that precedent is being set with volunteers suing for damages when they were acting as employees, and the court agrees you were functioning as a de facto employee, but we're not trained in X, Y, or Z. And so it makes a lot of sense to align those two things. They should be virtually the same.
Thank you, Don. All right, Jose, how do you go about getting staff buy-in for volunteers?
Yeah, I think that is something that I've seen every shelter struggle with. It is definitely it's interesting. It's this us versus them. Who cares more? It's like the who cares more wars. I've always found, like, I know the dog and I care more. And so I think part of it is a lot of what everyone has shared, which is like, how do you integrate them so that they're actually not separate? A part of that is when you start to hire staff, being really clear that working with volunteers and is in their job description. Ask them how they feel about that. Set that expectation like from the get-go. And then the thing that I've seen the most is we are very conflict avoidant in animal welfare, I think. That is just a 15-year assessment. I don't necessarily have the data, but it's my lived experience that this is true. And a lot of the issues that I would see between staff and volunteers, from a staff perspective, it was staff not knowing how to correct a volunteer, not knowing like what they could say, what they should say. So actually giving training on like, hey, it's totally appropriate. And here's how you go and actually explain how to do something, instead of like continuing to see that volunteer go in and out of the kennels incorrectly and letting a dog out and then just walking to the room and just under your breath being like, well, like actually be part of solving the thing. And so I think by setting expectations up front, that's part of the job. And then setting training to help. So I have a big belief system, which is you set reasonable expectations plus support equals accountability. People just want to jump to accountability these days, but you actually have to have reasonable expectations and then support training, whatever that looks like. And then from a volunteer side, some of the challenges I've seen, it's setting expectations of how volunteers should be working with staff. I've had some volunteers, because they're volunteer, feel like they can just say anything to a staff and kind of be really work in a way that isn't in alignment of our principles. And so making sure that everyone is operating with the same level of understanding of like, what is the social contract that we all have of how we're going to engage with each other? What are boundaries, so that we can understand those, like where do we interface and where are there, if there needs to be a very clear line, and there should be a good reason for that, articulating it and making sure people have the information for what that could be. But I find that a lot of it has to do with just setting expectations and then providing the support for a positive interaction and outcome.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Just real quick, you can document this as well. I've worked with organizations, so if you're going to have the same exact staff manuals, a staff manual, volunteer manual that are virtually the same, they should also have job descriptions. They should also be signing off on culture agreements. And there is no reason at all you can't put volunteers on an organizational chart. So you can hand them an org chart that will have a bubble with them in it, and it will show exactly who they can speak to and who is supervising them for an unmistakable illustration of what their role is, just on one sheet of paper. They should have the same kind of packet that an employee has. And then you're answering questions ahead of time, and it's not ambiguous at all.
I'm laughing, Don, because Mark and Nikki and I have talked in depth about org charts with volunteers on them. I'm going to pick up the pace here. I want to let Mark speak, and then we're going to pick up the pace because of time. And we've got 2 questions in the Q&A. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I was just gonna say Nikki and I are having flashbacks right now.
All right, Don, how about getting staff buy-in for your community? You know, you want the community to support the shelter, but I think that there are instances where the shelter staff see the community as the problem, but not necessarily as the solution, right? And so how do you go about getting your staff to see the community as the solution to life-saving?
I think I like Jose's take on this, where you have to set expectations from the very beginning. This can be 3 sentences that you use during an initial interview where you talk about, we believe here that open and transparent collaboration with the community is how we save more lives. Are you comfortable with that? And you'll find out very quickly someone who is or is not. In the absence of asking that question or making that statement, things will spring up because, you know, Jose, like you said too, the whole who cares most or I care better, you know, this is one of the greatest challenges facing the field. The notion internally that all of us have to some extent that no one loves animals like I do. But the fact is that we all love animals the same. So in this case, what I would do is just make sure that you're clear, make sure that you're able to explain ahead of time before they even join your organization exactly how you work. And then make your judgment about bringing them on board after that.
Good answer. All right, Nikki and Mark, we'll start with Nikki. Share with us how you go about engaging your community. What are some of the things you do locally to engage community members above and beyond your volunteers and fosters?
So we use social media. Obviously, that's kind of a go-to one. We use that a lot to just let people know what we're doing and how we're doing it. I mean, it's simple as like the hit by car cat that came in, and so they know what we're kind of up against and what we're doing. And it doesn't always have to be, it's a real story. It doesn't have to be fluffy. And so we use social media a lot. When we're out at adoption events, we talk about what we're doing. Again, going back to Jose stating, you know, you live your culture everywhere you go. And so when we're in the community, we're talking about what we're doing and how we're trying to be a part of the whole community, making a difference in the animals. It's not just us, and the rescues are part of that, the other shelters, and we're all a network. And while we are Midlands Humane Society and Council Bluffs, we work with lots of people, and that's what really makes the magic happen, to be honest.
Mark, what about in the Redding, California area? How do you go about engaging your community?
Yeah, so everything Nikki just said, we do all of that stuff, but we also, like today I did a radio show. I do a monthly radio show at Animal Hour on a community radio station the last Tuesday of the month. We also do all the social media stuff. We have Pet of the Week on TV and on radio every Friday. But really, the biggest engagement opportunity that we have, unfortunately, in our area is disasters, because we have them every single year. Our fire season used to be a few months a year, and now it's all year long. So we do at least, at least one big one, and usually 2 to 3 during the year of disasters. And we are full on when that happens. So not only are we there for the evacuations, not only are we there for the shelter side, but our community comes and donates food. Dog food, cat food, whatever we need, hay, whatever we need. And for the next week or so, even after the fire is contained and they're not really letting people back in, we're sheltering animals in place and working with our county sheriff's department to do that. But we're also going up and we're donating food and we're handing it off to our neighbors in the community. And that really is a huge opportunity for them to see Haven Humane and see us out in the community, because we're in our vans, you know, they're all wrapped, we're in our trucks, we're dropping it off. We're not asking for anything in return. We're asking what they need and we're helping them out. And really, honestly, that brings us so much goodwill and community involvement. And really, they do feel like we're part of the community and we're neighbors, and we enjoy helping them and being able to help them in their time of need.
And I believe, don't you do a fair for your local community as well once a year?
We do. We haven't done it in 2 years now, so next year hopefully we'll do it. But yeah, it's called Pet Fest, and we turn the back part of our property into basically a carnival. We actually have a pool that comes out for the splash dogs, so they do the dock diving right there on our property. And we have just carnival events and all kinds of stuff, and it's open to the community. There's no charge. We ask them to bring their animals. We have a West Mudster dog show, where we have it, and we have the lookalike contest and everything, and people love it, and it's become a community event. I hate that we haven't had it for 2 years, but next year we're looking forward to doing it again. So yeah, and that's just fun stuff where the staff is there, the volunteers are there, and the community comes out in droves, and it's with their dogs. We asked them not to bring cats. It doesn't go quite as well. Let's muster with the cats. But yeah, and it's a lot of fun.
All right, so we all know that shelters can deal with negativity from non-supportive community members, right? That never happens, right? So Jose, you came up through the ranks at Pima Animal Care Center. You started out as a vet tech, worked your way all the way to director. And I know it wasn't easy. It took years to get to no kill, right? So when you started out, it was the pound at first. So let's talk about how you deal with negativity from the community when they're non-supportive of your efforts, or maybe unaware, not only non-supportive, but unaware of your life-saving efforts. How do you deal with that?
I feel like I'm going to be triggered throughout this and need to call my therapist immediately after this call. First of all, I'm just like, my eyes already twitching, just thinking about, it's hard. I think being a shelter leader is is a really tough job, because it's like everyone is so passionate and everyone has a very distinct idea of how animals should be saved, which animals should be saved. And so it just creates a lot of things. And so here in the seat that I'm in now, with a little more wisdom and space between that life, I've come to realize the first thing, we used to get some really tough press. The shelter, like the kill shelter, like any article was always negative. And so we were defensive about it. And it actually was part of the narrative of why we had such conflict with the community. And that kind of transcended to how we adopted this attitude of like, well, they suck. They think we suck. Well, no, you suck more, and that attitude permeated at intake with adopters in the field. Like, that was the culture. And then I realized we actually are not saving the amount of animals we could and should be saving. And they're actually, while the approach I don't appreciate, what they're criticizing us on, there's some truth there. We, at the time where you name it, we were one of those shelters that we were doing the best with what we knew, but we could and should have been doing better from a community cats perspective, from supporting the community perspective, open adoptions, how we cared for animals while they were in our care. So the first step is to take a breath, maybe, go to one of those rage rooms to just get that initial emotion out, and then look for the truth of what people are actually saying. Look beyond the approach and see, like, where is that? And then we realized, okay, we need to actually operate differently, not just because, one, the public is kind of telling us that's what they expect, and we were a municipal shelter funded by taxpayers. So we had a judiciary obligation to kind of listen to the public, And then we realized, if we start to change the way we do, if we change the philosophy of how we operate, and which transcends our operations, that is actually going to change a lot for us. So we changed from the inside out. And what is interesting, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, is the better we did, the more lives we saved. Sometimes the criticism became more acute, because now, like, we had a profile. We were celebrated amongst communities, other animal welfare organizations, as this progressive shelter. So whenever we weren't doing something that someone felt was in alignment with that, because we were now on this platform, they kind of came even more intensely. And so part of it is you have to create room for self-care. That's the first thing as a leader. You must create space and create good, positive echo chambers. Like, who are the people you can go to who are going to tell you the truth, even the hard things, but they're going to deliver it in a way that is productive. So creating a council of people that you can really respect is important. And then creating the self-care mechanisms that you don't take this home and internalize it to the degree that becomes destructive to yourself, and therefore you're not able to be of use and of service to your team, to your community, to the mission. And then I think some keyboard cowboys, it's a thing. People are going to say lots of things, and you have to decide where you want to put your time and energy, where you want to respond and where you don't want to respond. And you have to be really tactical and strategic about it. But in essence, look for the truth, take care of yourself and create a council of people who aren't going to just tell you what you want to hear, but who are really going to give you kind of the truth of the situation. So everyone needs a North Star to kind of go towards. And so as long as you are settled in who you are and what you're trying to accomplish, and you are doing everything within the information that you have and the resources you have to do the right thing in front of you, then you have to just continue to push forward, and do your very best to not take it personal. And it's hard when it's your name written in all of these places, like I've had death threats come to my home, and it's a tough position to be in, but build a support system.
Excellent. Mark, I think you want to add to this, and then I'm going to move on. We've got about 15 minutes, so I'm going to move on to board support, but go ahead and answer this question too.
Yeah, really quick. And Jose hit the nail on the head with the people that give you the constructive criticism, but I'm going to talk about the people that don't give the constructive criticism. And I have a saying that I say all the time at work: don't feed the trolls. There has to come a time where you just look at that social media and you're just like, you know what, if there's nothing positive that can come out of you commenting, don't comment. And what I found is that the community actually comes to our defense, because if you're doing everything right all the time, the people that may have been on the fence before aren't on the fence anymore. They're on your side and you're a supporter. And I found that when we don't comment, other people go, well, wait a minute, why are you even saying that? Did you know they do this and this and this? And it's nobody even works for us. It's nobody I even know. And so that's going to happen. The other thing that I'll say is this, and this is what I said at my initial interview for this job, 9 years ago. My job is not, and your job is not, to ever remove that target on your back, because you will always have a target on your back as a shelter. It doesn't matter how good we do, you're going to have a target on your back. And your job is not to remove that target. Your job is to make sure that target is as small as possible. And yes, things are going to happen. That target's going to flare up a little bit, and your job is to bring that target back down. But don't beat yourself up if you can't get rid of that target, because you can't. You're not going to be able to. We just have to do the best that we can to make sure we keep that target as small as possible. And if you're doing all the other things right, it will happen.
Very well said. Thank you. Okay, last section we're going to talk about is board support and relations. And I have to start with Don, because he does a lot of consulting around board governance. So Don, take a few minutes and tell us what successful board relations and governance should look like.
Sure. So if you're working for a nonprofit corporation, there's a good relationship for you as an executive director. The one that I found that's worked best over the years is the board needs to know their roles, and they need to know your role. So you're the employee that they hired to operate the shelter. Your responsibility is operations. Operations shouldn't be any board member's responsibility. However, you may have a liaison to the board that you speak with, and the board president works well for this. So really good relations with the board president or liaison, a partnership with the executive director, no board intrusion into operations. Effective meetings has a huge positive influence. If you can help them work around to having planned agenda meetings with time limits on pieces and no subjective things coming flying in from the sides. 100% fundraising participation, active ambassadors to the community, and also meeting all of their legal requirements, the things that they need to do as board members. So every organization that I've worked on a rescue with, shelter rescue, has had a dysfunctional board. Most of them were that they didn't know. Board members didn't know what they needed to do. No one had ever told them, because all you got to do to be a board member is say to someone who's incorporating, they're like, I'm gonna incorporate as a nonprofit. Jose, will you be on my board? And then Jose could go, yeah, sure. And never having been on a board or whatever, they don't know what to do. And for folks in animal welfare, the first thing you want to do is be saving lives. And they'll say, oh, all this stuff, it's not, I'll just sign the paper and get it done. But somewhere down the line, you are going to wish that you had a board that had been trained and is periodically retrained and does all the things they need to do, because eventually you're going to hit a leadership transition if the founder starts to age out and thinks about retirement, or you're going to hit a crisis that is ginormous and in some way involves the board. So successful board relations and governance are I can tell you my personal preference. There's no reason for a board member to be at the shelter. Now, many places have board members who volunteer at the shelter, and that line blurs, and it works out okay for them. But if anything ever happened where that line didn't work, if there was a conflict between a board member and a staff person, or a board member and a volunteer, you have immediately run into a very complicated situation where an employee may have grounds to push back on it legally, because the only person that employee reports to is the director, not the board member, not any board member. No board member can hire or fire or do any of those things. So you just want to make sure that just get online, go to any one of the national nonprofit sites, get all the stuff you need to understand how a board's supposed to operate, get them job descriptions, get a copy of Robert's Rules of Order, throw away the stupid stuff, keep the good stuff, and make sure that everybody's trained and understand their responsibilities. If you can do that, then you will have a board that'll be a powerhouse in helping you get your stuff done.
Thank you, Don. And Don has shared some templates for board of directors, job descriptions, conflict of interest, meeting agenda notes, et cetera, and so on. Those will be in the resources, as well as our playbook on working with a 501c3 board. So I do want to ask this last question of both Nikki and Mark, since they are active executive leadership at a shelter. How do you guys feel about board term limits? Mark, you can go ahead and go first.
So I'm in favor of them for sure. When I got to Haven, they had just put in board limits, and Haven was a very close-knit circle because of it. And the board had been together for umpteen million years. And if you weren't friends with the board members, then you weren't part of Haven. And so even an organization that had been around for 60 years, people still didn't know we existed, and that was a big problem with it. So they instituted board limits. Our board limits right now are 3 3-year terms, and they have to be off the board for at least 1 year. I have had 1 or 2 come back, and that was great because I wanted them to come back, and so did the board. But I do think that it's something that kind of protects you from that, because if they stagnate, it can really, really hurt the organization.
Nikki, what are your thoughts?
I would absolutely echo everything Mark just said. So we're a very young organization. And we went through this question now. I've been here 6 years, and we've changed them twice already. We just moved it to the 3 3-year terms. But we had lots of discussion too, that just because they did a 3-year term doesn't mean they get to do another 3-year term if they're a problem board member. And so that was one of the main conversations we had. But I do think term limits are important. I think getting new perspectives and new ideas with new board members is just invaluable. I mean, it's so valuable to know new perspectives coming in. And so, but there is a lot to say about having people that know the history. And so there's a balancing act with it that it's a teeter-totter, but board limits, I definitely agree with.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. So Mark, you already answered Anthony's question. I'm just going to read it aloud. Mark, you mentioned onboarding is a 3-day process. He's talking about staff. Do your new hires start on designated days only? If so, how often do you have people start? So will you just answer that, Mark, so the audience can hear the answer?
Yeah, so we do it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So they start on Tuesday, they finish on Thursday. And we only do 2 maximum, just because we don't want more people than that doing the onboarding and being in each office. We just don't have the space, to be honest, with that. And then if somebody is missing, usually it's a key person. Usually it's actually my executive assistant who does the HR stuff. If she's not there to help with paperwork, then we might push it off a week. But yes, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is the only days that we do it. And we let all the managers know so they expect them when they get there.
Excellent, thank you. And then we have another question. What is the panelist experience with field services when they don't report to the shelter? How would you suggest other directors or teams engage field services that don't report to the shelter? I think Jose, Mark, Nikki, any of you could take that. Anybody want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I can say just really briefly, these can be very challenging situations, right? And so all you can do is everything that you might think to do in order to build a bridge and to make a connection. And you need to be prepared for the fact that it may not work. However, if they're outside of your organization, then all you can do is try to connect to them. Is there an officer that's the head officer? Find ways to connect with people, and don't go charging over with, I'm here to connect with you regarding the distance between, just go find those people, talk to them, find them, when they're off shift, see if there's a way. I mean, if you run into them in a restaurant, every single direction you can come at this might be fruitful. And building that relationship is the most certain way you're going to be able to make change. Another way you might be able to leverage is, if the person who the head of ACOs report to, is part of a municipal, like the town manager or whatever, as you might find sometimes in smaller towns, those relationships might help as well. It might ease your way into that other relationship. So, if you're in a municipality, every informal relationship you can grow inside the structure of that municipality can help you. So start every relationship you can and make that relationship about nothing but the relationship, right? And then that will provide you little avenues that you might be able to use later. And that's the best that I can think of. And then sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And acknowledging that and being prepared for it is another thing that's important as well.
Thank you, Don. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that question? Okay, I have put a link to the resources in the chat for the audience. And also, if you do have additional questions for the panel, but weren't able to ask them this evening, feel free to email me at team2025@bestfriends.org, and I will be happy to share those questions with the panelists and respond accordingly based on their feedback. So I do want to take a moment to say a very gracious thank you to Jose and Mark and Nikki and Don for your time and your expertise. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us this evening. Again, take a look at the resources in the Google Drive I've posted. Reach out to me at team2025@bestfriends.org if you have questions. And if not, then we appreciate your participation. And thank you for everything you guys are doing every day in and out to save as many animals as possible and help us get to No Kill 2025. It's truly an honor to engage with all of you. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.